Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much. I was walking over here during Senator Cassidy's questioning, and so he may have been covering some of the same ground that I hope to cover with you, Dr. Scherholz, on this sort of extraordinary increase in the gap between the pay of CEOs and average workers. And it sounds like that was the space that Senator Cassidy was in, so maybe I'll just give you an opportunity to sort of continue to expand on your answer. But, listen, people's heads just shake. I mean, frankly, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, when you tell them that today the pay ratio for S&P 500 companies from CEO to worker are 299 to 1. In Connecticut, we've got a cable company, which is a regulated industry in which the CEO is making 687 times the median worker at that cable company. It just doesn't make sense to anybody. And so maybe I'll ask the why question, right? You've got sort of a lot of data to sort of explain how unionization can shrink that differential between CEO executive pay and worker pay, which has never been bigger than it is today. But what drives that? Why is that the case?
That's a really good question. I think the way that I think about this is, as we talked about, the decline of unionization explains a huge share of the rise in inequality over the last 4 decades, and the rise in CEO pay is a really big part of the rise in inequality over the last 4 decades. And I think a useful way to think about it is the decline of unionization has led to a big shift, a big upward redistribution in money from workers to corporate executives and shareholders, and that's where the skyrocketing CEO pay really comes in. And that we just have this incredibly unbalanced playing field right now, and legislation like the PRO Act would do things that would just make it possible for workers who want to join a union, want to join together with their colleagues, to be able to do that.
I think it's a really good point. Without the ability for unions to argue for a bigger share of that money to end up in their pockets, and without other effective checks on the explosion of CEO pay, that imbalance just gets worse and worse. Mr. Pierce, I know we've talked in and around this subject of abuses that happen during organizing drives. And again, maybe I'm treading on a little bit of ground that's already been covered, but we had an instance in Connecticut where groups of workers were trying to organize at McDonald's restaurants that were part of our rest stops along the highway. And there's reporting to suggest that as a means of trying to intimidate those workers, McDonald's actually called ICE and sent in immigration enforcement officials to threaten family members of workers. Just absolutely extraordinary tactics. There are much more sort of mundane and more pedestrian intimidation tactics that take place all the time. And it seems that our current enforcement structure is just not nearly strong enough to disincentivize these kind of abuses. Why does the current system not work to create a level playing field? Why does it allow for so many employers to get away with captive audience meetings and threats and sort of low-level intimidation? It just, at least anecdotally in Connecticut, as I talk to folks that are trying to organize workers, and I talk to workers, the breadth of intimidation and harassment seems to have exploded. And it just doesn't seem like our current regulatory structure can keep up with the ways in which employers and union busters innovate to try to prevent folks from being able to cast a legitimate, free and fair ballot as to whether they want to join a union.
It's a simple cost of doing business because the penalties are so light. Yeah. We're talking about an agency that is incapable of self-enforcing its orders, and we're talking about an agency that cannot impose any kind of sanctions that have a meaningful bite to it. Quite frankly, and I've said this before, I would submit that an employer can fire an individual who is trying to start a union and put the money that would probably be owed to that employee when reinstated in a simple interest-bearing bank account, and by the time the employer was obliged to have to pay the employee back, the employer would have made money and would have been able to stop unionization and probably write the expense off as a business expense. This is why the PRO Act changes the game. One, it gives solid damages to the employees and if the employer has engaged in these unfair labor practices. And two, it mandates that the General Counsel go in and seek injunctions when employees get terminated, so employees are not caught in the weeds in the ordinate periods of times before justice comes about.
Well said. Thank you both. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Madam Chair.